Hello, this is Dr. Muriel Rand, and this video is for planning task 1 of edTPA for early childhood education. Let's get started. The first thing that you're going to do for task 1 is to complete the context for learning. In order to do that, you have to select a class. Most of you will only have one class, but you must have a minimum of 4 children in your class. So if you don't, you might have to pull in other kids, or we'll work with you on that. If you don't get permission from 4 children, you can videotape and maybe blur them out. But anyway, the minimum that you have to show in your whole group is 4 children. You're also going to select 3 focus children. You don't need these right now, but you're going to need them later for task 3 and even for task 2 when you're videotaping. So it's easier to just figure out who they are right now. And at least one child must have specific learning needs. Now, for edTPA, specific learning needs could be a child with an IEP or a 504 plan, but it doesn't have to be. A child with specific learning needs could be an English language learner, a struggling reader, or a child that is maybe a little bit slow learner or having some struggles in learning. So when you fill out your context for learning, there's a section at the back in which you are going to write down any of the special learning needs that your students have. Make sure you have at least one child in there with specific learning needs. You're going to gather and submit your context information all about the school, the type of classroom, about your curriculum, and fill all that out. The form is on Blackboard. You're going to download it. It opens up as a Word file, and you can type right into it. It needs to be no more than 4 pages, including the prompts. So that part is easy. Just part A is the context for learning. Okay, part B are your lesson plans. You're going to plan 3 connected literacy lessons. These lesson plans have to be in literacy. And we have a lesson plan template for you on Blackboard, so use that lesson plan template. And consider your curriculum guide. Talk to your cooperating teacher so that you can decide when you need to videotape, and that way you'll figure out what you will be teaching at that time. It should be, maybe about week 4 or 5 of the class. So you've got to get this done pretty quickly. And you're going to have no more than 4 pages per lesson plan. Now let's go over some lesson planning tips. The first thing I want you to know is that you need to use the correct standard. The subject area is literacy, and there's a link for the New Jersey Learning Standards in week 1. New Jersey does not use the Common Core State Standards anymore. We did, but we haven't used those for a few years. So they're called the New Jersey Student Learning Standards. You can get them on Blackboard, or you can just Google it. You can use any standard that applies to your learning sequence. And remember that there are 6 standards, so choose the correct one. Reading literature is used when you're reading fiction texts. Reading informational text is used if you're reading nonfiction texts. Reading foundational skills is the standard you use if you're teaching phonics or for phonemic awareness. And then the writing standard, there's 3 types of writing: narrative, which are stories; informational and explanatory, which are like essays; and then persuasive, which is opinion writing. And then there's a standard for speaking and listening and a standard for language. You're going to be including vocabulary anyway, so I would recommend that you choose one of the other 6 standards rather than language. Although, talk to me or give me some feedback if you really want to do language. Now, when you're looking at the standards, there are anchor standards in that document that apply to K-12 learners. They're very general. And they start with that NJSLA. So notice that at the beginning. Those are the ones you don't want. They're too general and they're not going to help you, and it's just going to confuse you. Instead, you're going to use the grade level standard. So if you'll notice my example right here, RL 2.2, that tells me that it's the 2nd standard for 2nd grade. So it should have a number there that it corresponds to your grade level, and that's the standards that you want to use. Don't include New Jersey when you describe the standards in the lesson plans or the commentary. You're not supposed to use that. You're not supposed to identify what state you live in for privacy reasons. Okay, more lesson planning tips. You need to decide on a central focus. That's the central focus is what all 3 lessons have in common. Your lessons should connect to each other and build on each other. So what they learn in lesson 1, they should then use in lesson 2, and what they do in lesson 2, you should build on in lesson 3. I recommend you use only one literacy standard for each lesson. I think it'll be easier for you to plan that way. And you can use the same standard for all 3. Like if you were creating a class book, for example, you might use the narrative writing standard for all 3 lessons. Or you could use different ones. If you were focusing on reading comprehension, you might use, on the key details section, you might use the standard for the theme, and then you might use the standard for the character, who's the main character, and then you might use the standard for retelling the story. So it depends on what you want to do, but they have to be connected. Create an objective that relates exactly to your literacy standard. The standards in New Jersey for literacy are written quite well, so sometimes you can just use the standard itself. And you're also going to integrate another subject standard into your objective, but one objective for each lesson is best. I'll go over that interdisciplinary stuff a little bit later. So you're going to have an interdisciplinary component, such as science, social studies, art, or music, but the main focus has to be literacy. Okay, in the section where it says planning knowledge and conceptual understanding, in the knowledge section, this is the low-level skills that your students will demonstrate, like spelling and punctuation. Those are low-level skills. And the conceptual understandings are the higher-level skills, like expressing themselves or analyzing or creating a new story. Those are higher-level thinking. You can use Bloom's taxonomy for this. There's a handout on Blackboard, and you can look at the type of activity that you want for each level. Okay, let's go into the main learning sequence now. You're going to use a reader's or writer's workshop model. So the first step is going to be the teacher-directed modeling. This is when you teach the students the skills. You could be reading a book out loud in which you model how to figure out what the theme is, or the characters, or the plot. Or you could be demonstrating writing skills, such as how to get started or how to add like descriptive words or something like that. Or you could be teaching phonics skills to help them to decode better. This should be short. It's considered a mini lesson, so no more than about 7 to 10 minutes. Remember, you've got young children, so they're not going to be able to sit and listen for more than that. Then the next section should be your guided practice. Have the students engage in the activity that you want them to be doing with you. So if they have to figure out who the main character is, have them do that all together as a group with you so that you can support them and make sure they know what they should be doing. It could be a turn and talk. It could be a chance to write their topic sentence. It could be a chance to practice different types of adjectives, etc., etc. And then finally is your independent practice. And this is when you send the kids off to practice the skill on their own. It could be independent reading in which they find the main character in their own book. It could be a writing activity in which they create their own text, or a hands-on activity in which they match letters and sounds. This is when you can work with a small group of focus students. On your videotape, you're going to need to have a small group, so this is the perfect time to do that, is during your independent practice part of the lesson. A word about active and multimodal learning. You're going to see this in your planning commentary, and you're going to see this in your instructional commentary and your assessment. What do they mean by active and multimodal learning? They mean they want to see hands-on, developmentally appropriate lessons. They should be engaging with open-ended, multi-use, rich materials, play, physical action, hands-on experiments. I want to see music. I want to see you singing. I want to see you moving, dance. Remember all of the things that you've learned in your curriculum. These should be really exciting, hands-on, developmentally appropriate lessons. Keep it social. Have the children engage in conversations, generating and asking questions, following their own interests. So you could do centers where they can choose what they want to do or choose what materials they're going to use. The scorers are all early childhood people, so they're going to be looking for this. No boring worksheets. You do not want a lesson where the children are just sitting and listening to you and then doing a worksheet or watching a PowerPoint. That's not going to get you a good score. So again, remember your early childhood. Okay, the next thing you have to have in your lesson is a vocabulary focus. You're going to choose a few vocabulary words that you want the children to learn during your lesson. And you are going to describe how you will teach the words and get the children to use the words. In edTPA Task 3, you'll need to provide a video that shows them using the words, or you're going to provide work samples in which they use the words, like in writing, for example. Another section in your lesson plan is going to be modifications and accommodations. So you're going to list the ways that you will modify your lesson for the 2 children with special learning needs or 1 child with special learning needs, your focus children. So think about all the different ways that children might need a little bit of extra support. They could have an IEP, they could be struggling learners, they could be gifted learners, they could be English language learners, they could just be a little bit slow developmentally. And you're going to describe the modifications you will make for these specific children. You don't want to have general things like, oh, the children are going to help work together, or I'm going to put the words on the board. In this section, you're going to say, for the child who's an English language learner, I'm going to give her cards with the words on it so that she can remember it. Or for the child who's a struggling learner, I'm going to give her a graphic organizer to organize her thoughts. Or for the gifted student in my class, I'm going to give her an extra activity that she can do in addition to the one that's on there, right? So you need to be very specific for the children that you put in your context for learning. And you can check Blackboard for ideas to help you with the modifications and accommodations. Now let's go to the formative and summative assessment. You're going to describe how you will monitor your students' performance in each lesson. And note that the informal assessment, they expect that to happen throughout the entire lesson. Your assessment should not be only at the end of the lesson. So you want to assess during your modeling. You're going to do a formal assessment during your guided practice, and then you're going to do an informal assessment or a formative assessment during independent practice. And then you will also have a summative assessment, but we'll get to that in a minute. You can use observational notes or checklists. You have to make sure that you're assessing all of your students. So you can't just walk around and see who needs help. That's not a good formative assessment. You can walk around with a checklist and see who's been able to be successful and who still needs some extra help, but you can't just wing it. You will need to later describe how you gave feedback to your students. In Task 3, you're going to have to show feedback, so it's important to plan for how you're going to give your students feedback throughout the whole lesson. For the summative assessment, you can do a formal assessment that can be a finished writing piece. Maybe they're going to write their own story, or a completed graphic organizer. Children could retell a story with puppets. They could complete a worksheet, anything like that that is sort of the summary of what they learned for that lesson. So describe your formal and informal assessments. In another section of Task 1, you're going to provide a copy of any of the worksheets, graphic organizers, or whatever your students hand in. If your students don't hand anything in, that's fine. You're just going to describe what they have to do for their final assessment. You must collect the assessment information from every student, as I mentioned earlier. Okay, so how do you prepare the files for Part B? You're going to submit your 3 plans for the learning segment in one file. So all 3 plans go into one file, but within that file, you're going to label each plan: Learning Experience 1, Learning Experience 2, Learning Experience 3. And again, use the lesson plan template that is provided on Blackboard. Part C is your instructional resources and materials. This is easy. You're just going to list what you're going to use during your lessons. For example, the children's books you might be using, the graphic organizers, the hands-on materials. You can include photos pasted into your document, and you're going to put that description of your resources and materials in a separate file that you will upload. The citations, by the way, they're actually going to go in your planning commentary, but you will need to have them. So to prepare the files for Part C, again, you put all the materials in one file and you label them by the corresponding learning experience. So Learning Experience 1, instructional materials, Learning Experience 2, instructional materials, etc., and order the materials as they're used in your learning segment. Part D is your assessment files. Again, you're going to put these all together in one file and label them by the corresponding learning experience. So learning experience 1 assessments, learning experience 2 assessments, etc. Again, order them as they're used in the learning segment. And for this part, you're going to include copies of blank assessments. You're not going to include work samples. That comes later. This is just the blank one so that they can review it and see what you're going to do. Part E is the planning commentary. This is the main part of task 1. It's really the lesson plans and the planning commentary. You're going to download the planning commentary template from Blackboard, and you're going to type right into it. Again, it downloads as like a Word file, so you can open it in Word, and you can type right into that. Use Arial 11, single space with 1-inch margins on all sides, and this should be no more than 9 pages. I will say, though, that in order to respond to your prompts thoroughly, I think your commentary should be close to those 9 pages. If you've only written 4 or 5 pages, or even 6 or 7, you probably need to go back and add more depth to your responses. Let's go through what you have to do for the planning commentary. There are 5 questions, and each one of them require a substantial amount of detail. This is the way they're going to tell how you're thinking like a teacher while you're planning. So the first question is all about your central focus. In other words, what you're planning to teach. So you're going to describe the central focus and the purpose of the content you'll teach in the learning segment. And then you're going to describe how the standards and learning objectives for your learning segment support children's active and multimodal learning language and literacy development in an interdisciplinary context. What does that mean? You've got to tell them how you're doing this developmentally appropriate. How are you getting the kids up, moving around? How are you getting them to be social? How are you giving them choices? How are you giving them materials that are hands-on? And how is it interdisciplinary? For example, I had a candidate last year that they wrote a book, but the book was about the 4 seasons. So there was science content that was embedded into the lesson. You could also embed social studies content. So maybe you're reading a book and the main character, you might focus on your social studies goals of character development in terms of being a good person or family or caring or the community, something like that. So you want to integrate an interdisciplinary context that is part of your lesson plan. You're going to explain how your plans build on each other to support children's language and literacy development through, guess what, active and multimodal learning. Have I convinced you that they want the kids to be active? Multimodal means cognitive, physical, social, emotional, right? That's what multimodal means, that you're using all of your different ways of learning and that you're active. You're not just sitting and listening to the teacher. You're also going to describe how the physical environment in which you're teaching supports the active and multimodal nature of children's learning. And if in your view the physical environment in which you're teaching does not adequately support the active and multimodal nature, just describe what changes you would make. They recognize that as a student teacher, you don't have full control over this. Okay, the second question on the planning commentary is your knowledge of children. So the first part of that is just what you know about their development. So describe their social and emotional development and be specific. You can say that they're very social, they're very good at speaking with one another, you've done turn and talk a lot, so they know how to do that. They can emotionally regulate and calm down when they don't get their own way. Or you could say the opposite, that they're very immature socially and they really need a lot of help talking to each other and getting along, and they need a lot of help to calm down. Cognitive and physical development, you can talk about what you have been working on so far. Like you could say, we've already studied narratives, now we're going to study persuasive writing. Or the students were struggling with narrative writing, so we're doing it again. And their physical development, you could talk about their fine motor coordination, their eye-hand coordination with writing, for example. And their language development for communication. How good is their language development? Perhaps you have English language learners who need a lot more support for syntax or vocabulary. So describe this in detail. pick specific children that you can talk about and give details. Don't do this in a generic way. Don't say, oh, the kids are very high cognitively and their physical development is great. No. Be very specific. The second part of this question is to describe the personal, cultural, and community assets. And by this, the word I want to point out to you is assets. Assets means positive things. So what are the personal things about your students that you know that you can use in your lesson planning? For example, maybe they just love books. So you're going to make sure that you have books in your lesson because your kids can't get enough of books. Maybe they love writing or they love art. So you're going to include some drawing with your writing because they love to draw. Or culturally, maybe culturally they are English language learners and they are learning new language, and they've been working on having conversations. So you might want to build conversations into your lesson plan. Maybe you have a lot of African American students and their families are very adept at storytelling. So you might want to include that. Or in your community, perhaps there are a lot of restaurants in the urban area where the kids live. So you decided to have them create menus or to pretend to put a restaurant in your dramatic play area to develop their language skills. So again, think about positive things that your kids bring to the learning and how you're going to include those in your lessons. The third question is how you support children's development and learning that you just discussed in 2A to C. So in question 2, you're describing all of their assets and what they know and what they can do already. In question 3, you're describing how you incorporated those into your lesson plans. Okay, now you can discuss all of the children in your class. Like you could say, oh, we just went on a field trip to the farm and therefore that's why we're making a book, because the kids were all interested in the farm. And then you also should talk about individuals with specific learning needs and how you're going to support them in this lesson planning. So the child with an IEP that says that they can have modifications, you'd describe that right there. You're also going to describe the common developmental misunderstandings and how you will address them. For example, children often retell stories out of order, so you're going to give them cards that will help them keep it in order. Or children often have trouble understanding the difference between narrative writing and persuasive writing, so you're going to give them a graphic organizer to help with that misunderstanding. Question number 4 is supporting children's vocabulary development. So here's where you're going to go into more depth. You have this in your lesson plan already, but here you're going to go into more depth. You're going to identify the key vocabulary, and then you're going to describe how you're going to basically teach the vocabulary. How are you going to give the kids opportunities to develop, practice, and use the key vocabulary? And do this by identifying the plan day and the number of the plan. So on day 2, we're going to do a learning experience number 2, and they are going to incorporate the key vocabulary into their writing, for example. And again, how you support the children to develop and use the vocabulary. And then planning commentary, question 5 is how you're going to monitor children's learning. Again, you've got this in your lesson plan already. This is just go into more depth here. Give more examples, describe how you're going to collect the information, how you're going to adapt it. Remember that it is not only acceptable, it's important to adapt your assessment for children with specific needs. So for example, if you had a child that's an English language learner, for your assessment, you might need to read the directions out loud to that child. Or if you have a child who's a struggling learner, you might give them a graphic organizer that's partially filled in already. Something like that. So think about how you're going to adapt your assessments so that all the children can be successful. You're going to provide the citations for the source of all materials that you did not create. Any published texts, any children's books, websites, material from other educators. If you got a graphic organizer off of Teachers Pay Teachers, put that here. anything that you're using from your curriculum guide. So if you're using a graphic organizer or a rubric from your curriculum guide, list all the citations. They do run your portfolio through a plagiarism checker. So make sure that you cite anything that you did not develop yourself. And note that the citations do not count towards the 9-page commentary limit. So recap, what's submitted? Part A is the context for learning. Part B are your plans for the learning segment. Part C are instructional materials. Part D are the assessments, and Part E is the planning commentary. Each of these must be in a separate file. Now, to end this, we're going to look at the scoring rubrics for Task 1 so that you can see what you will actually be scored on. There are 5 rubrics, and you're going to get a score on each of the 5 rubrics. The first rubric is planning for the whole child, and in order to score a 3, your plans for instruction must build on each other, and they must include multiple modalities with connections to the active nature of children's learning. So this is where you're going to get scored for having your lessons be developmentally appropriate for young children and that they build on each other. The second rubric is planning to support varied learning needs. This is where you're going to discuss the supports that you will provide for children with special learning needs. For rubric 3, using knowledge of children to inform teaching and learning, in order to score a 3, you have to justify why the learning tasks are developmentally appropriate, using examples of children's prior academic learning or personal, cultural, and community assets. And you have to also make connections to research and or developmental theory. And if you want to get a score point 4 on this rubric, you can't have superficial connections, you have to have deeper connections. So you're really going to cite research, you're going to cite developmental theory and explain how you use that to develop your lessons. Rubric 4 is identifying supporting vocabulary development. So they're going to see whether you have identified vocabulary related to the learning experience and the central focus, and that the plans include general support for vocabulary development. Rubric 5 is planning assessments, and you are going to have, you'll be able to score a 3 if you provide evidence from multiple modalities to monitor children's learning at some points during the learning segment. So in other words, it can't be just at the end. It has to be at different points throughout the learning segment. And when they say multiple modalities, they don't want to see just a worksheet. They want to see that you're assessing their ability to converse, their ability to write, to read, to to make choices. Again, remember the developmentally appropriate practice. Okay, that's it. So my final advice is to read the handbook for planning task 1. You've looked at it already, but I want you to open it up again and go through that as you're writing your lesson plans and as you're writing your planning commentary. Keep going back to the handbook. You can also go back to this video. You can stop it wherever you need to so that you can read the slides. And I think this is going to help you and you'll do really well on task 1.